Nobody in that room knew they were watching history being made. The venue was small, barely bigger than a living room, cigarette smoke hanging low across the ceiling, the walls sweating from the heat of 200 bodies pressed together in the dark. Liverpool, 1958. A city still pulling splinters from the war out of its skin. And on a Tuesday night, in a room that smelled like damp coats and cheap beer, a teenage skiffle band was playing to a crowd that wasn't entirely listening. But one boy was. He stood near the back, barely 15 years old, thin-shouldered in a second-hand jacket that didn't quite fit, his dark hair falling forward across his forehead. He wasn't dancing. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was perfectly, completely still, eyes locked on the guitarist's left hand, tracking every chord change, every finger movement, every small technical decision the player made without thinking about it. While everyone else in that room was living inside the music, this boy was trying to understand it, to take it apart, to see what it was made of. The young guitarist on stage noticed him first. He'd seen plenty of fans before, but this wasn't a fan. This was something different, a stillness in a room full of motion that drew your eye the way silence draws your ear. During a break between songs, the young performer stepped off the low stage, crossed the room, and said the three words that would quietly, permanently change the history of modern music. "Do you play?" What followed wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a headline. It was just a boy pulling a battered guitar from nowhere and playing something so clean, so precise, so far beyond his years that the room seemed to hold its breath without knowing why. That young performer was Paul McCartney, and the boy in the second-hand jacket, the one nobody was watching, was George Harrison. If you think you know this story, stay right here, because what happened next will change the way you hear every Beatles song for the rest of your life. To understand what that moment meant, you have to understand the world those two boys were living in. Liverpool in 1958 was not a city that handed anything to anyone. The docks were quieter than they used to be. The bomb gaps between terraced houses still hadn't all been filled. Families lived tightly, worked hard, and kept their dreams small, because small dreams were the only kind that survived the arithmetic of that life. For the teenagers growing up in those gray streets, music wasn't a career. It was an escape route that most people quietly accepted they would never actually use. Paul McCartney had more reason than most to need that escape. In October 1956, his mother Mary died of breast cancer. Paul was 14 years old. The loss carved something out of him that never fully grew back. And he poured everything that was left, every feeling he couldn't speak, every grief that had no shape, directly into music. By the time he joined John Lennon's scrappy skiffle group, the Quarrymen, in 1957, music wasn't something Paul did. It was the only thing holding certain parts of him together. George Harrison understood that kind of devotion without needing it explained. He was born in Wavertree, Liverpool, the youngest of 4 children. His father Harold drove buses. His mother Louise was warm, curious, and fiercely supportive of a son who seemed, from the very beginning, wired differently from other boys his age. While his classmates chased ordinary things, George sat in his bedroom for hours, not doing homework, not sleeping, working through chord shapes on a cheap guitar until his fingertips bled, and then working through them again. The song he was obsessed with was a 1957 instrumental called Raunchy by Bill Justice. It was fast, clean, and technically demanding, exactly the kind of thing a serious young guitarist would choose to master, not because it was easy, but because it wasn't. George learned every note. Then he learned them faster, then faster again. He and Paul attended the same school, the Liverpool Institute on Mount Street, and rode the same bus every morning through the same tired streets. Two boys from the same world, carrying the same hunger, not yet knowing they were looking for the same thing. But one of them was about to find it first. And the man standing in the way wasn't someone either of them expected. George Harrison didn't ask for an invitation. He created the conditions for one. After that first night, after Paul McCartney crossed a crowded room and asked a quiet boy if he played, George began appearing at Quarrymen gigs with a consistency that was impossible to ignore. Not loudly, not pushily. He simply showed up, positioned himself near the back or along the sidewall, and watched. Every performance, every rehearsal he could find his way into, every informal session where guitars came out and someone started playing, George was there, still, focused, absorbing everything with the same intense concentration that had first caught Paul's eye. Paul noticed the pattern. You couldn't miss it once you'd seen it. One morning on the bus to the Liverpool Institute, Paul sat down across from George and asked him straight, not testing him, genuinely curious, whether he actually knew how to play or whether he just liked watching other people do it. George didn't answer with words. He reached down, pulled his guitar from its case, balanced it across his lap on a moving double-decker bus in the middle of a Liverpool morning, and played raunchy from the first note to the last without once looking at his hands. Paul sat back. The bus rattled on. Neither of them said anything for a moment. What Paul was experiencing in that silence wasn't just admiration. It was something more complicated and more honest than that. George Harrison, at 14 years old, was technically cleaner than Paul already was. His left hand moved with a precision and an economy that took most players years of discipline to develop. Paul recognized it immediately, and rather than let that recognition become competition, he made a decision that said everything about who he was. He brought George's name to John Lennon. John's answer was immediate and immovable. No. The boy was 14. He was too young for the venues they played, too young for the image they were building, too young, full stop. Paul pushed back quietly, but didn't let it go. John, he said, you haven't heard him. John Lennon, in the autumn of 1958, was 17 years old, grieving his mother Julia, who had been killed by a car just months earlier, and running the Quarrymen with the fierce protective energy of someone who had decided this band was the one thing in his life he could control. He wasn't interested in gambles. He wasn't interested in potential. He wanted certainty, and a 14-year-old boy from Wavertree didn't look like certainty to anyone. But Paul McCartney wasn't asking John Lennon to take a gamble. He was asking him to trust what he'd already heard himself, and John hadn't heard it yet. If you've ever believed in someone before the rest of the world caught up, you already know exactly what Paul was feeling in that moment. Subscribe and stay with this story, because the next 60 seconds of it will stop you cold. Because John Lennon finally agreed to hear George play. One song, one chance, and what happened in that room didn't just decide George Harrison's future. It nearly ended it before it began. The audition didn't happen in a rehearsal room. It didn't happen on a stage. It happened on a bus. A gray Liverpool evening, the upper deck half empty, the windows fogged with cold breath and cigarette smoke. John Lennon sat with his arms folded across his chest. Not aggressive, just closed. The posture of someone who had already made up his mind, and was only here because Paul had asked him, once too many times, to simply listen. Paul sat a row back, close enough to watch both of their faces, and George Harrison, 14 years old, sat directly across from John with his guitar resting across his knees like it was the most natural thing in the world. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then George began to play. He played raunchy, the same Bill Justice instrumental he had been working through every day for the better part of the year. The same song he had played for Paul on this same bus just weeks before. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, there was something at stake, and George Harrison played like he understood exactly what that something was. His left hand moved with a precision that had no business existing in a 14-year-old. Clean chord transitions, fluid timing, every note landing exactly where it was supposed to land, without a single moment of hesitation or apology. John Lennon didn't move, didn't speak. His arms stayed folded. George finished. The bus rattled through the dark. And then, without anyone asking him to, without explanation or performance, George simply started again from the beginning. The same song, the same notes, but looser this time, more confident, more settled, like the first run-through had been him finding his footing, and the second was him actually arriving, like the song had finally exhaled. Paul was watching John's face, and something was happening there that Paul hadn't expected. Not softening exactly. John Lennon didn't soften. That wasn't how he was built. But the certainty that had been sitting in John's expression since the beginning of the evening was shifting into something quieter. Something that looked, if you caught it at the right angle, almost like recognition. 3 months before this bus ride, on a July evening in 1958, John Lennon had lost his mother Julia, struck by a car outside their home and gone before John could reach her. The grief had gone somewhere inside him that he couldn't access directly, and music had become the only passage into that place. The only thing that made the loss bearable was playing until the feeling went somewhere it could exist without destroying everything around it. And here was this 14-year-old boy sitting across from him on a bus, playing a guitar with the focused, urgent devotion of someone who needed music the way other people needed air. John recognized that need, not consciously, not in words, but somewhere underneath the folded arms and the careful expression, something in John Lennon understood exactly what he was looking at. He uncrossed his arms, looked across at Paul, and what John said next made Paul's stomach drop completely. John Lennon said he was still too young. That was it. No argument, no lengthy explanation, just a flat, quiet verdict delivered with the particular finality that John had perfected, the kind that didn't invite a response because it wasn't a discussion. George was talented, yes. John wasn't blind, but talented and ready were two different things, and a 14-year-old boy who couldn't legally get into half the venues the Quarrymen played was not a solution to anything. He was a complication, and John Lennon had enough of those already. Paul didn't fight it directly. He knew John well enough to understand that pressure produced resistance, not reconsideration. So he waited. And in the meantime, George Harrison did what George Harrison always did. Rehearsals he hadn't been invited to. Sessions at someone's house where guitars came out after dinner. Afternoons at the morgue skiffle cellar where the Quarrymen sometimes practiced in the basement. George was always there. Never demanding anything, never pushing for recognition, just present, watching, absorbing, quietly, making himself impossible to pretend wasn't there. Paul continued arguing George's case in private, carefully, persistently, in the spaces between other conversations. Not pleading, just returning to it, again and again, the way water returns to the same channel. John listened, said nothing, changed nothing. Then one afternoon, at a loose rehearsal that was winding down into casual noise and conversation, something happened that nobody planned. George had picked up a guitar in the corner of the room, not performing, not demonstrating anything, just playing for himself, the way musicians do when the pressure comes off and the music becomes private again. He was playing something slow, something that moved between chords with a quiet, searching quality. The kind of playing that doesn't know it's being heard and is better for it. John Lennon was in the next room. He stopped talking mid-sentence, just stopped, and listened. He stood there for nearly a full minute, not moving, not saying anything, listening to a 14-year-old boy play guitar in a way that had no audience and no agenda, and no performance in it whatsoever. Just need. Pure, undisguised musical need. John walked back into the room, sat down across from George, who looked up and went still, uncertain what was coming. John looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Paul. "All right," he said quietly. "He's in." Paul exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. If you've ever had someone fight for you, the way Paul fought for George, before you'd proven a single thing, you already understand why this moment still matters. Subscribe and stay with this. Because what those three boys built together in the years that followed defied everything that anyone thought was possible. But George Harrison's first rehearsal as a full member of the Quarrymen didn't go the way any of them expected. Because the moment he walked into that room as an equal, everything shifted. And not everyone was ready for what he brought with him. The first rehearsal George Harrison attended as a full member of the Quarrymen was not a celebration. It was an adjustment, a recalibration, the kind that happens when something genuinely new enters a room that has already decided what it is. John was watchful, not hostile, just measuring. Paul was quietly relieved, doing the careful work of making space without making it obvious that he was doing so. And George sat with his guitar and said almost nothing, the way he always did, and simply began to play. And the room changed. What George brought wasn't volume or ambition or the urgent need to be noticed that drove so many young musicians. What he brought was precision, a clean, melodic clarity that wrapped itself around the raw energy in the room and gave it shape. John's ferocity needed something to push against. Paul's melodic instinct needed something to anchor it. George's technical discipline provided both, without asking for credit, without announcing itself, without taking up any more space than the music required. Paul watched it happen in real time. He would reflect on it years later, not in grand terms, not with the language of mythology that tends to accumulate around Beatles stories, but simply and honestly. He hadn't discovered a guitar player that afternoon on the bus. He had recognized something, a quality of devotion to music that he understood instinctively because he carried the same thing himself, the same grief converted into sound, the same need wearing the shape of a chord. After that first rehearsal ended and the room began to empty, Paul and George walked out together into the gray Liverpool evening, guitars on their backs, neither of them saying very much. They didn't need to. Something had already been decided that no conversation could have arranged. And within 4 years, those boys from Liverpool's gray streets would step off a plane in New York City, and nothing in the world of music would ever be the same again. The boy who couldn't get into the clubs eventually sold them out. George Harrison went on to become one of the most beloved and influential guitarists of the 20th century. 600 million records. The Ed Sullivan broadcast that stopped a nation mid-breath. Beatlemania sweeping across continents like a tide that nobody had seen coming and nobody could stop. And beyond the Beatles, All Things Must Pass, My Sweet Lord, a solo career that proved the Quiet One had always been carrying something the world wasn't yet ready to hear. John Lennon, who had sat on a Liverpool bus with his arms folded and his mind made up, would later count George among the most important musical relationships of his life. The boy he had almost turned away became the guitarist he could not have built the greatest band in history without. And Paul McCartney, the teenager who crossed a smoky room and asked a still, watchful boy 3 simple words, never described what he did that night as a discovery. Because it wasn't. George Harrison didn't need to be discovered. He was already there, already devoted, already playing raunchy in the dark until his fingers knew it better than his own name. Paul simply opened a door that George had already been standing outside of for years. He didn't find a musician. He recognized a brother. If this story moved you, subscribe, hit that like button, and share it with someone who still believes that the right person noticing you at the right moment can change absolutely everything. Because sometimes it can.